Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard, and this is a collaboration between the Global News Podcast and Ukrainecast from the BBC World Service. In this edition, recorded at 14 hours GMT on Tuesday, the 8th of March 2022, international correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse, Vitaly Shevchenko of BBC Monitoring and other experts both here and in Ukraine will be answering your questions about what's happening within that country and in response to events there. So let us begin by meeting Gabriel Gatehouse and Vitaly Shevchenko, stalwarts of Ukrainecast. For those people who do not yet subscribe to Ukrainecast, tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko. I'm a Russia editor at BBC Monitoring, but I'm from eastern Ukraine.
I'm Gabriel Gatehouse. I am a BBC foreign correspondent for many years. I've been based all around the world. I'm now the international editor for a programme called Newsnight, but really my background and my heart is in Russia and Ukraine. I've spent many years looking at that part of the world.
Well, we asked Global News Pod listeners for their questions about what's going on, and they sent in a great many of them. So let us press on. Mm-hmm. Events are continuing to move very fast in Ukraine. As we record this podcast, it's day 13 of the Russian invasion. We spent nearly 2 weeks watching extraordinary images of devastation being rained down upon Ukrainian cities, hearing the voices of those affected, and seeing an exodus of more than 2 million people so far, desperately trying to escape towards the west. Time to try and answer some of the many questions sent in. Given the shock of it all, quite a lot of people still want to know why. Let's begin with Anthony Torres in New York.
What are the motivations behind Putin's invasion of Ukraine? And how is he trying to rewrite the past in order to justify violence in the present and thus control the future?
Hi, I'm Bar and I'm writing in from Leeds, UK. And the question I have is, why did President Putin decide to invade Ukraine now rather than any other time?
My name is Tessa, and I'm a master's student living in Berlin, Germany. What does the timing of these escalations imply about Putin's goals?
Well, I mean, it's so difficult to answer this question, mainly because I and many, many others, most of the people that I know that know the most about Putin and the Kremlin and Russia, we didn't see this coming, right? We were completely blindsided by it, as were, I believe, I've got this from decent sources, people around Putin. So I should caveat all of this by saying, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think what we've learned from the fact that he did this, and he did this without apparently consulting even many of those closest to him in the Kremlin, is that his calculus of what he wants to achieve, we thought he wanted to achieve a Ukraine as a sort of non-NATO member buffer state between Russia and NATO. He wanted to achieve a seat at the top table with the Americans. Maybe that's not what he wants to achieve. Maybe he actually believes his own propaganda and that he's fighting this kind of Nazi threat. I mean, at this point, I think that's possible. I don't know what you think.
It's all very true. And looking at what had been happening before the war, I did get the feeling that things are about to get really, really tense and difficult. And the answer to the question of why did Putin attack Ukraine now is, I think, is because he felt the moment was right. And he had spent months preparing for this. He had achieved a situation when there's no force within Russia. There's no political party or political leader who could challenge him on any of the policy issues. The most important and prominent opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, is in jail. His organization, called the Anti-Corruption Foundation, is banned. Almost all independent media in Russia have been banned or blocked. There are curbs on social media as well. So it feels as though Putin thought, the time is right, I can do it now.
When Russia's full invasion began in the early hours of Thursday, the 24th of February, they went in on 3 fronts, north, east and south. As we record this edition, civilians have begun leaving the besieged Ukrainian city of Sumy after Russia agreed to pause its bombardment there. Civilians are also being evacuated from the town of Irpin near the capital, Kiev. I hope that we can talk to Lise Doucet, our correspondent in Kiev now. Lise, can you hear me?
Yes, hello from Kyiv.
Hi,
a
Lise.
Very cold winter day.
So what can you tell us to begin with about what's going on right now?
It's the 4th day to try to ease the suffering. grievous suffering of so many civilians in Ukraine getting underway, but it's the fourth day that efforts are being stopped by shelling. There was some progress in the Sumy, which is east of Kyiv, where we had heard a lot of international students were stranded. The city was under Russian shelling. We heard that they were able, helped by the Red Cross and others, to get some people on buses so they could leave. But the last I heard was that there had been an outbreak of shelling there, so it has been stalled. To the west of Kyiv, the capital, in Irpin, where our listeners may be familiar with Irpin now. It used to be a charming train stop town just outside of Kyiv. Now it's been under incessant Russian shelling for many days. 1,000 people were able to leave yesterday. We understand that hundreds have been able to leave today, but the exchanges of fire between the Ukrainian and Russian forces continues. The big question is what is happening in Mariupol, encircled for the past week by Russian forces, running out of food. There's no running water, but with stories that people were drinking from puddles in the streets, no heating with sub-zero temperatures, dead bodies lying uncollected. There was a convoy of trucks and buses trying to get in to bring food and take people out. It was stopped by shelling. The scale of the humanitarian crisis is such that you can really only help all the people in dire need by what is often called in conflicts a humanitarian pause. That is, fighting across the country stops to allow hundreds of thousands of people to leave, not just what we're seeing now, people fleeing by the hundreds.
Well, let's hear some more from listeners now about what an occupation in a city means.
It's Alexander from Dijon in France. We often hear that a city or region remains under control or that it has fallen. So what does it mean?
My name is Summer. I am a Chinese citizen working in Colombia. What would happen if Russia took over Kiev?
So, Lise, let's start with you.
People have predicted that if President Putin tries to send his forces in, there could be a long, drawn-out insurgency here. And I'll be interested to hear what Gabriel has to say about that. He knows this city very well. There had always been this scenario, and I think this is what they say was on President Putin's mind, although again, we just have to simply speculate about that, was that he thought, and some of us thought that these first days sitting in Kiev when the invasion began, that Russian forces would sweep down. We kept hearing about assassination attempts against President Zelensky that were foiled. And now we see him showing up in his office for the first time since February the 24th, the start of the invasion, saying, I'm not hiding. I'm in the office, almost taunting Russians, which is a dangerous game. But the scenario that possibly they wanted was to rush in, assassinate Zelensky or put him out of action, bring in their own puppet government, do something to swiftly seize power. But the days when you could take over the TV tower and the presidential office, take over the airways and declare victory are over. So that swift, simple scenario doesn't seem to have happened, at least not yet. The military one seems to be one that will run into huge logistical, political, and all kinds of other problems. We just don't know, but I think there are a number of scenarios which could happen when that day comes, and many believe it will come someday, when that lumbering convoy or convoys coming from another direction finally move into the streets, right into the heart of the city where we're speaking to you now.
We now have to say goodbye and thank you to Lise Doucet in Kiev. Thanks for talking to us, Lise.
Bye, Lise. Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
A great pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.
Let's
Thank
hope
you so
one day
much.
soon we can
Bye-bye.
have another peaceful meal in a Kiev restaurant.
In beautiful Kiev as it is today. The beautiful, beautiful Kiev. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise. Well, last week the stakes were raised considerably with the news that Vladimir Putin had put his country's nuclear force on high alert. Let's hear from Pranav, a listener in Osaka, Japan.
It was quite scary to see Putin's nuclear escalation. Can you provide some analysis on this, particularly in the context of a recent statement by UNSC on abstaining from nuclear weapons?
My name is Sam Lamu. I'm 70 years old. I live in Lindesberg, Sweden. Will Russia use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and what would happen if they do?
And we also heard from Annalise in Waco, Texas, wondering she tweeted us to ask which countries would be most at risk if the nuclear threat came to pass. Let's start with you, Gabriel.
First of all, let's hope that he doesn't, right? But he has threatened it, so we need to grapple with this issue. There are two different types of nuclear weapons. There are long-range nuclear weapons and what's known as strategic nuclear weapons. Long-range ones are the kind that you fire from somewhere in Russia and they hit London or Washington or whatever. The strategic ones are kind of short-range ones, smaller bombs, but nevertheless devastating in their power that they might use on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, when Putin made that threat a few days into the invasion, that he was putting his nuclear forces on special alert, we weren't quite sure, did he mean the short-range ones or the long-range ones? And I think, in a way, there's a bit of kind of constructive ambiguity there to keep everyone guessing, because the whole point of having nuclear weapons is the fear factor.
Following on in an equally apocalyptic frame of mind, Anna in Costa Rica got in touch. She wanted to know, what are the conditions? How would you define Third World War? Well,
I suppose that's when more than two countries are at war with each other, when things get sort of multi-dimensional. So at the moment, we've got a situation where Russia's at war with Ukraine. Perhaps Belarus is involved, but this is a sort of
NATO planes above Ukraine, targeting Russian planes.
Right. I think that would very quickly sort of evolve into a multi-dimensional war involving NATO states. What does China then do? Do you know what I mean? I think that's the point at which you start. And we will come to China
a little later in the podcast. We've been talking a fair bit about information and misinformation. There are viral, unverified videos, cyber attacks. Access to international news websites in Russia has been heavily restricted. The BBC is available on good old-fashioned shortwave radio and the more high-tech dark web. Journalism has become a lot more risky. A lot of people want to know how to inform Russian people and what they are actually hearing. So 13-year-old Rafael Calderon in Zurich got in touch. He said there was a lot of talk about the role that digital media had in the US 2016 presidential election. Mm-hmm. So can't the West use a similar capacity to inform the Russian public? And Madhumita in Manhattan had a similar question.
I think it's brilliant that Ukraine has a dedicated IT army fighting misinformation and cyber attacks. Even though Ukraine isn't part of NATO, is it possible for the US and world allies to aid in this cyber effort and break through to the majority of Russian people who typically get their news from state TV?
My name is Guillermo Herrera, and I'm living in Poland. How does Russian propaganda hide or explain all of the support for Ukraine that we see in media and sports?
Vitaly, let's start with you. This is your area of expertise.
The main source of uncensored information for Russians are social media. The Kremlin has tried to block them, but the reality is such that you just can't, because people know about virtual private networks and various other tools, and they will be able to access Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, even though they are banned in Russia. And a couple of other two, I think, most important remaining independent sites. They're blocked, but they're accessible via various tools that circumvent the blocks. Now, it's true that for most Russians, television is still the most important source of information, and their messaging has evolved from just talking about neo-Nazis in Ukraine and how the Russian speakers are under threat. Now, the Kremlin seems to be very aware of the fact that Russians are hearing and seeing reports about horrific atrocities happening in Ukraine, civilians dying, civilian infrastructure being destroyed, and they've come up with a strategy to confront that. They're saying that it's the Ukrainian forces that provoke Russian fire, or alternatively, that footage from computer games is being used to accuse Russia of atrocities.
But it's interesting that because that's exactly what the Russian Ministry of Defense did in Syria, right?
Absolutely.
they faked up an attack using.
So they're trying to turn the tables.
I now that we know that we can say hello to our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, who is at home and will be picking apart the sanctions questions for us. We've had a lot of questions about just how effective sanctions might be. There are financial sanctions on banks, institutions, individuals, international payments. Sporting events have been cancelled or relocated. Russian and Belarusian athletes have been excluded from the Winter Olympics. There are cultural boycotts and sackings. But do such measures work? Yannick in Cambridge in the UK wants to know.
Could you imagine the worst case scenario of economic and political sanctions that the world could impose against Russia?
G'day, this is Jo Holland from Newcastle, Australia. If the sanctions work and the war gets expensive, is it possible that Russia might seek financial or other support from China?
So, James, many are wondering, can Russia afford this war?
There are armies of academics, professors who write very learned books on why sanctions work and sometimes they don't work. What's clear is the actual sanctions themselves are working, as in, assets are being frozen, people are being restricted from their travel, companies are being banned from selling high-tech kit to Russia. So they are working in the short sense in terms of they're doing what they're supposed to do. The question, of course, is, does it actually change any minds in the Kremlin? Does it deter Vladimir Putin from taking any courses of action? That is much, much harder to prove. But clearly, if you talk to officials in the West, they all say, by and large, look, we don't expect anything to happen in the short term over this, but they do expect this to be a long-term issue. So in other words, the expectation is that these sanctions will be in place for a long term, and that might have some impact in thinking in the Kremlin, so that eventually a decision made. But nobody expects that a sudden sort of cessation of hostilities is going to be created because another few oligarchs have been stuck on a list somewhere.
And Vitaly, how prepared was Russia for this?
Well, that's the tragic thing, that that's what Ukrainians want: hostilities to stop now and bombs to stop raining down on their cities. As far as Russia, whether it's prepared or not, I would say that President Putin had spent many years accumulating this wealth, his gold reserve, his currency reserve, and he is sitting on a huge pile of cash, and he knows that.
This is not him personally, right? This is the Russian state.
Well, it can be argued that Putin is a Russian state.
There's also reporting that suggests that Vladimir Putin is sitting on a large pile of cash, but these are separate piles of cash, right?
There's that as well. But the point is that he's not going to this unprepared. He had done a lot of homework, and he waited and waited and worked, and then he decided, now's the right time, now I can afford to do it.
Can I just say something about the other side of these sanctions? Because I've just got off the phone with a friend of mine who's a Russian journalist who's had to flee the country with his whole family. He's now out, but he has no access to any of his money, right? He can't get hold of it. He doesn't have a non-Russian bank account, so no one can give him any money. He can't get any of his money out of Russia. And because Visa and MasterCard have stopped their operations, he can't get anything on debit or credit, right? So sanctions are a very blunt instrument, and they hit a lot of people who really aren't involved.
And we heard from Joe in Australia wondering about China's role in all of this, and Martin in Vienna wanted to know about China's stance as well. James, let's go to you first.
Oh, well, this is a really interesting question. I mean, the Chinese have been sitting very firmly on the fence, not condoning nor condemning, saying yes, this is terrible, and that they'll be happy to talk and have some kind of mediation role in trying to bring a cessation of hostilities. I think the really interesting question is whether or not China sees this as a sort of geostrategic opportunity, because potentially they have substantial leverage over Russia. Because if it turns out that these sanctions do bite, and that the Chinese are the one country that is buying a substantial chunk of Russian oil and gas, then in that place, that means Beijing suddenly has, a hell of a lot of leverage. How is it going to use that leverage is a really interesting question. We're not quite clear on that yet, because they could use it to intervene, to put pressure on the country, and you've got to stop this. And sort of, in other words, establish themselves as this century's new hegemon. In other words, using this as an opportunity to say, look at us, We are now what the United States used to be. We are the peacemakers. We are the people who come in with the sheer military and economic heft to bang heads together to end conflicts. Now, it's not clear yet whether China wants to do that, but that potential opportunity is there. At the moment, Xi is talking, but he's not jumping.
And James, Jana, a listener in New Jersey, the US, she was wondering about other BRICS countries and what they might do.
So countries like India and Brazil and South Africa, these kind of countries, I mean, they are largely sitting on the fence as well. Most of them abstained in the big UN vote on this the other day. India, for example, is a massive consumer of Russian weaponry, as well as being heavily entwined with Russia economically. So is staying firmly out of this and not condemning at all.
James, that vote at the UN, just tell us exactly what that was.
This was a vote that was put up by the Western countries to try and condemn and deplore the invasion. There was a big diplomatic, over 100 members of the General Assembly backed it in the end. But the crucial success diplomatically was they managed to get China to abstain, which was they considered a step forward. They put a lot of work into that. They watered down some of the language so that the sense of condemnation was not as strong as it was in previous drafts.
Why was getting China to abstain? Why was that considered a victory?
Because their fear was that China would support the Russians, and that was the original belief that's where China was going to go, because they didn't want. They put a lot of work into that to try. As ever with those kind of negotiations, on all those things, it's just a bit of text. It has no impact. But it was simply as an attempt by the West to say, look, here's a list of countries who all oppose what Russia is doing. And trying to marshal the largest, consensus on that, was their aim. And that's what they got. And so, but certainly the diplomats in New York were very happy that they managed to get it.
It was interesting, wasn't it? Because the ones who voted with the Russians against it were, I think, Eritrea, North Korea, Syria, and Belarus.
Yeah.
What a club.
Yeah, it's quite a club.
Let's look at what might happen next. Bevan in Melbourne has been asking about Vladimir Putin's plans for Ukraine and if there is an end in sight. Jesslyn in Singapore asks this.
How do we see this conflict being resolved? For example, would there eventually have to be intervention from the NATO countries?
My name is Ellen from Washington, D.C. in the United States. How could someone get through to Putin that he is causing tremendous human suffering and that he needs to stop for the good of humanity?
So, Vitali, the likely outcomes.
Well, that's the terrifying thing about it, because there doesn't seem to be an easy way out for President Putin out of this mess. And also, the more determined he is to take control of Ukraine, the more counterproductive his efforts are. We've been seeing an upsurge in pro-Ukrainian feeling and in Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, for example, and almost 2 million people have fled Ukraine. And where did they go? They didn't go to Russia. They're fleeing westward. So that tells us that even though President Putin insists that Ukraine and Russia are the same country, the same people, that's not what Ukrainians think. So even if he succeeds in conquering Ukraine militarily, will he be able to keep control of it? For how long? And also, Ukrainians have seen now what the Russian army can do to their cities. There's very little love lost now.
I mean, the reality is that all wars, all conflicts end in some sort of negotiated solution, right? So that eventually is going to happen. And it was really interesting looking on Monday that Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, came out with a list of demands for peace that were actually a lot less than what Putin was demanding a couple of weeks ago before this whole thing started. I noticed one other really interesting thing that happened last night is that the Pentagon in the US came out with two very interesting assessments. Assessment number one, they believe that Russia has committed nearly 100% of the fighting forces that it had gathered on Ukraine's border, so nearly all spoken for at this point. Number two, that they don't see any movements of significant extra troops from inside Russia towards Ukraine's borders. Now, I am speculating here, but what does that tell us? Perhaps it tells us that the Russians are preparing to sue for peace and are prepared to accept something substantially less than what they were asking for a couple of weeks ago, which was kind of getting all the NATO military out of the East European countries and that kind of thing. The big question, as you alluded to, Vitaly, is will the Ukrainians accept this? Will they accept giving away sovereignty of Crimea, the separatist regions? Will they give the Russians a corridor into Crimea? Will they undertake not to join NATO in the next, I don't know, decade or something? That could be politically very difficult.
And Summer in Colombia and Isabella in Poland, looking to the future, they want to know what might happen to Vladimir Putin.
What would happen to Russia and Putin if Ukraine won the war with international help? Would Putin be judged as a war criminal in the international court?
Could Vladimir Putin end up being charged with war crimes and wanted by international arrest warrant for crimes against humanity?
Let's go to you, James.
I think it's highly likely that at some point the International Criminal Court will charge Vladimir Putin with something. I think it is very, very doubtful he will ever end up in a court. The problem with this is that the International Criminal Court has a very, very high bar. You know, you've got to prove a war crime has taken place. You've got to prove the intent, that the person who's charged actually intended it, and proving intent is always hard. And then even if that is proven, you've then got to get that individual into a courtroom. Now, the ICC can issue arrest warrants, but obviously they're only applicable in countries that actually sign up to the ICC, and neither Russia nor Ukraine are signatories to the International Criminal Court. The ICC goes on for a very, very long time, et cetera, et cetera. I think the one possibility that it might happen is if there were to be a new government in Russia. That is, in previous cases, there have where a former leader of a country has ended up in the ICC, has happened after the new government hands that individual over. Now, if you can imagine that scenario happening, that's the possibility for it.
Big if.
But I think that's a pretty big if.
How secure is Mr. Putin looking at the moment, Gabriel?
Pretty secure. I mean, I was looking, there was a moment in the first few days of this where you were just getting such a sense of shock from it, including from those close to him and around him, that you thought, my goodness, there might be a moment here where the inner circle of the Kremlin get together and, sort of in that sort of fantasy world, call him into a room and say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, thank you for your 22 years of service. Your car is waiting. Or something, some variation on the palace coup.
And that's how you know that a lot of preparation had gone into this, because he has made sure there's no potential challenger. There's right. No potential force that could unseat him. He's a towering presence.
But there was a moment where I thought all of those people around him, the sort of three legs of Putin's stool of power, the oligarchs, the technocrats, the strongmen, the Siloviki, many of them will be thinking, I did not sign up to living in a vast North Korea where I can't spend all the money I've been accumulating over the past couple of decades. And maybe they will either try and get him to change course or get rid of him.
But if you think, is there a name? Who can this person be? No name comes to mind.
Yes, but that was the same in 1999 when Yeltsin picked a no-named, unknown successor called Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And look what happened to that.
What have you made of all the commentary about questioning his sanity?
He looks very rational, just looking at him. And the way he talks, the way he moves his hands, he's a good communicator. But when you start analysing the essence of his messaging, that's when you begin to be a bit alarmed. To me, the moment when I started thinking, hang on a second, this sounds slightly unhinged, this can't be right, he can't be saying it, was when he said that the government in Kiev was run by drug addicts and neo-Nazis. That's when I thought, I would probably expect somebody on Russian TV to say that, but the head of state, the world's largest country, saying that sounds really, really alarming.
Yeah, because I've always thought of Putin as this kind of rational, tactical thinker, somebody who is quite ruthless and cynical but knows what he wants and has a good idea of how he wants to achieve it. a full-scale invasion of Ukraine does not fit into what I thought he wanted to achieve, right? So it's kind of hard to see what he is trying to achieve with this, because he can't capture and hold the whole of Ukraine. That's just, it's a non-starter.
I think one of the biggest problems that he is facing is his background as a KGB operative, I think, because people like Putin, Secret Service people, they're there to do what the government tells them to do for a certain reason, to achieve a purpose. Once people like him are the government, that's when the purpose becomes the process. And you start thinking, so what's the ultimate goal? What's the point of it?
That's very interesting.
But there's no strategy.
There's that famous line that I think came from an interview with Putin, where he talked about his time in Dresden, and when the Berlin, he was the KGB, a KGB agent in Dresden, and as the Berlin Wall was falling, protesters gathered outside the KGB headquarters, 1989, and they were all kind of going, chanting against the Soviet Union and down with the KGB. And Putin remembered this. This is one of the formative moments of his life. He picked up the phone and he called his superiors in Moscow. And I just always remember this phrase that he used about the response. He said, "Moskva молчит." Moscow is silent. There was no one at the other end of the line to tell him what to do, right? It was,
and that is precisely
the rug was pulled out from
his
under
problem
his world.
right now. The deception, the propaganda, they seem to be not a means to an end, but
At
that's
the
what-
end.
The end.
And I think that is our cue to say thank you and goodbye to James Landale. Thank you for talking to us, James.
Thanks, James.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Can I ask you something, Jackie?
Yes.
You're getting all these fascinating questions from different people from all over the world.
Yes.
And they all seem to be broadly supportive of Ukraine in this.
Yes.
Did you get any questions that were sort of assuming a support for Russia?
Not so much assuming a support for Russia per se, but there were certainly questions about NATO's behaviour and what might have prompted Mr. Putin to take the action that he did, and whether or not some of the NATO countries, the West in general, had provoked him, had broken previous agreements. So there were a couple of questions
Certainly
along
many
that
Russians
line.
feel that, and yeah.
Quite a lot of people, though, asking, are there any good ways to end this? Are there any positive options to see the end of this this crisis in Ukraine?
Well, the way crises work, they lead to something else, to something new. And the hope now is that at some point, when the dust settles, we'll have a new reality in which countries that were once parts of the Soviet Union, they can peacefully coexist, and nobody will see anybody else as parts of their near abroad or backyard. And that's the hope. But looking at the way things are currently, it seems to be that this kind of future is so far away, and the whole political system in Russia will have to change, because currently it's so firmly dominated by President Putin and his way of seeing Ukraine, the West, in very antagonistic terms of us versus them. So once, if and when that changes, then we'll be able to talk about a positive outcome. But right now, it's difficult to imagine the kind of future.
I think that if Ukraine comes out of this with its independence intact, it will come out of it a much, much stronger and more unified country, where possibly this whole kind of division between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers has almost been laid to rest, if you like, by this kind of shared threat. I'm afraid the future looks much bleaker for Russians and for Russia, because I think that barring some kind of removal of not just Putin, but this whole regime, and as you say, Vitaly, that there's nothing that can replace it at the moment, I think Russia is facing some very dark and repressive times.
Thank you both. And that's it from us for now. Our thanks to Vitaly Shevchenko, Gabriel Gatehouse, Lise Doucette and James Landale. And most of all, thank you to you, all the listeners who sent in your questions, and apologies if we did not have time to get to yours this time. Normal Global News podcast service will be resumed later. If you'd like to comment on this podcast, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. You can also find us on Twitter Twitter at Global News Pod. Do remember, please, to subscribe to the Global News Podcast and to Ukrainecast as well. You will find that wherever you get your podcasts. This edition was mixed by Gareth Jones. The producer was Theope Skarlatos. The editors were Karen Martin and Sam Bonham. I'm Jackie Leonard. Until next time, goodbye.